Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, the Statue of Liberty is reopened, along with a few national parks. But elsewhere, much of the United States government remains closed for business, 2 weeks after hardline Republicans in Congress blocked a new annual budget. Now, they'd been demanding that lawmakers rescind what Barack Obama and his supporters regard as his crowning achievement to date, a universal health care law that was passed by both houses of Congress last year and validated by the Supreme Court. Now, Republicans have since dropped that demand, but the showdown is far from over. All eyes are now on another, perhaps even more critical deadline, and that's this Thursday, October 17th. That's the day when the U.S. government's authority to borrow money will run out, and that will put the world's biggest economy at risk of not being able to pay its bills for the first time in history. Unless, of course, lawmakers agree to do what's been routine procedure in the past, raise the debt ceiling. How'd the U.S. get to this point? And why does it seem these type of crises are happening more and more often in America? What would the founding fathers think of today's political paralysis? Well, with me now in the studio, my guest today, Alix Meyer. Thank you for being here, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
A U.S. specialist, political and government specialist. You're at Sciences Po Lyon. Spent time in the U.S. You were a Fulbright scholar at Princeton. You know U.S. politics, but more importantly, for our purposes, you also know it from an outsider's perspective. I want to ask you right away, as a foreigner looking in at what's going on in the U.S. or what's not going on in the U.S., this shutdown, how does this happen? This can't happen in France. What do you think when you see this happening in the United States?
Well, you got to really separate what happens from what you think should happen based on your own perspective. Looking at it from the French perspective, we tend to believe that the government should have a sufficient majority in the legislative branch to follow its really routine instructions, such as just funding the operations of the government. Under the United States Constitution, what you have is a system of checks and balances with separation of power. What this means technically is that for any law to actually pass, it needs to be adopted in exactly the same language in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and then signed by the president.
But it's gotten to the point, this isn't checks and balances right now, Alex. This is checks. There's nothing moving.
That is true. And that is a function of having a divided government and a divided Congress with political parties that have become so polarized. It used to be that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were really wide-ranging political parties with diverse ideological coalitions, so that you could have bipartisanship between Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Now, for the last 30 years or so, what we've had is each political party becoming more homogeneous, so that Republicans only vote with Republicans and Democrats only vote with Democrats, which was fine as far as it went, until you have a Republican majority in the House that needs to agree with the Democratic majority in the Senate.
But doesn't it get more complicated than that? Because within the Republican Party, some people might say that the leaders of that party have lost control of their own base. And specifically, you know what I'm talking about, the Tea Party.
Yes.
No one can control them.
Yes, and what I think is interesting from a French perspective is trying to understand what is the rationality inside the Tea Party, because there is one. If you look at those members of Congress who are pushing for really extremist positions of not negotiating with the president, what they see is that in their district, they have the necessary support. They have the people in their district pushing them towards this position, and they are doing their constituents' bidding, they think. So that it's rational for them to push this kind of
it's rational politically
for this group of people, but it becomes destructive for the whole party as a brand. And this is where it becomes a function of the way campaigns are financed in the United States, now that political parties as an organization, as organizations, have become weakened, paradoxically speaking, compared to outside groups who then start playing a very important role in
lobbying groups,
lobbying groups or outside groups who have a lot of funding opportunities to really have an influence on the process itself.
Perhaps a disproportionate influence. But you raise another question. You use the word district. Now, for our viewers, in the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, the Republicans have the majority. In the Senate, it's the Democrats. Those districts are drawn up in very, very weird shapes in ways, I suppose, that ensure only one candidate, and perhaps either Republican or Democrat, will ever win.
That is true. There is some what we call gerrymandering going on through designing districts that only favor Republicans. Unfortunately, that's not the only reason that we've seen polarization. The other reason is that the American people as a whole tends to be sorting out, geographically speaking, in homogeneous communities, so that even if you draw perfectly square-looking districts, you would have the similar kind of problems. And you see this also because you see the same problem in the Senate, where the districts are not drawn, they're just the limits of the state.
Right.
So this problem of parties diverging, ideologically speaking, is very structural and very deep, actually.
And I guess very hard to remedy as well. I want to throw at you a quote by a columnist for the New York Times, Paul Krugman. Listen what he wrote recently. Quote, "It's been obvious for years that the modern Republican Party is no longer capable of thinking seriously about policy. Party members believe what they want to believe, and any contrary evidence is dismissed as a hoax, the product of vast liberal conspiracies." A lot of Europeans might agree with that, maybe not a lot of Americans.
Well, unfortunately, what you have is also media that has become fragmented in which certain members of a certain coalition, conservatives will only watch conservative television or listen to conservative talk show radio hosts, and likewise on the liberal side, so that you have separate niche of understanding of the world that
Separate
worldviews not communicating with one another. And you end up, if you look at the right-wing blogosphere today, what they're saying is you should keep pushing. You should not cave, and the world will not end if the United States reached the debt ceiling, which is contrary to what most economists are saying. But they simply do not believe it.
It's a different discourse. I just want to address the debt ceiling because
Yes.
this is a different issue. We've been talking about the government shutdown,
Yes.
the paralysis. The debt ceiling is essentially in 2 days' time, the U.S. government will run out of its authority to borrow money.
Yes.
It won't default right away, but it could. The world is very worried about that.
Indeed. And
Exaggerated worry or real worry?
well, that is not clearly for me to say. What I can tell you is that certain members of the Republican parties are simply not buying it. They do not believe that is true. They think that Treasury has the authority to prioritize payments for the U.S. bills, U.S. notes, U.S. bonds, and therefore avoid the technical default that would be not paying back investors. Now, that would mean drastic cuts to the operations of the government, and especially drastic cuts to payments for Social Security benefits, food stamps, and all programs that
Still a
send
default, isn't it, down the road?
It would be a default to certain members of the community, but not to the investors, which they think is the only qualification of a technical default.
Who'd be paid? Because it's not just, as you know and I know, it's not just Americans who hold the debt of the U.S. Treasury. The Chinese have almost half, right? 40% of U.S. debt, trillions of dollars.
Well, that's where the political aspect of this becomes important, because you would, in such a theoretical situation, you would pay the bondholders in China and not pay the retirement checks to people in the United States. Now, I think it's pretty easy to see that that would not fare well in public opinion. So another way to look at this is that they are saying they do not believe in these facts of the problems as a tactical tool in the negotiation.
Okay.
So that way they can actually stir the conversation away from what the Democrats would want to talk about, which is getting rid of the sequester.
Which is the spending cuts, really.
Cuts, which are supposed to kick in on January 15th, on top of already huge spending cuts. And so Democrats are trying to negotiate on spending cuts, and to avoid those spending cuts, the Republican right wing is pushing the conversation away so that simply acknowledging reality becomes a concession.
So this is really a much broader debate about tax and spend policy that isn't going away, even as many people say is likely they do reach an 11th hour deal. The debt ceiling's raised. We could still see this again in a few weeks, a few months. It's going to recur.
It's very likely. It's been recurring again and again. And I would add one thing that will probably happen as well, is that the votes to raise the debt ceiling in the House of Representatives will come from the Democratic Party, from the minority party. And only a share of that vote could come from the Republicans. So that really what's driving this seemingly dysfunctional process is members of a majority party in the House of Representatives acting like a minority party, acting like a sheer opposition party, only willing to oppose what the president is trying to achieve.
Trying to do. Very briefly, we're out of time. Do you consider the United States right now to be a functioning democracy?
That would be a very hard judgment to make as far as I'm concerned. I see a lot of veto points and a lot of actors willing to exert influence on each and every of those veto points, whether it be the minority in the House, a minority of the majority, or whether it be the minority in the Senate willing to filibuster, as we've seen.
Filibuster means talk without stop.
As long as you want.
Alex, this couldn't happen in France.
This could not happen in France under the Fifth Constitution. It couldn't, no.
So not an argument, perhaps, for changing it to the French system of government, but at least some food for thought as the U.S. government remains in shutdown. Alix Meyer, you are a U.S. government political specialist, Sciences Po Lyon. Thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we've been talking about what is a looming crucial deadline just this Thursday. Will the U.S. government run out of authority to borrow money? Will lawmakers extend and raise the debt ceiling? You've been watching the interview here on France 24.